Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, where you are. This is Samir Hnawi, Vice President, Business Development, Middle East for Emerald Publishing. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar of COVID-19 crisis and the Arab world. Before we go forward, I would like to share some housekeeping points with everyone. We'll start in a few minutes the webinar itself. I would like to draw your attention to the how to ask questions, how to use the webinar facilities. The orange arrow opens and closes your control panel on your right-hand side. You can change the audio options to computer or phone. All attendees' microphones will be put on mute. Use your question tab to ask and present questions during the presentation. We will answer all of the questions by end of the presentation. The presentation will be recorded and will be shared afterwards on our social media and the email system as well. Today, I'm accompanied by two colleagues, Michelle Phillips, who is the Senior Product Manager at Emerald, who's going to give us a brief about what's Expert Briefing, how to use Expert Briefing in academic world, how to use it in teaching and research across your career. Also, we are accompanied by the Senior Analyst from Oxford Analytica, Laura James. Let's start first with Michelle, who is going to give us a brief introduction about Emerald Expert Briefing. Over to you, Michelle. Hello? Michelle, do you hear me?
Okay, very classic. I'm very sorry. I had myself muted. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. We'd just like to tell you a little bit about Expert Briefings. So I was wondering if we could go to the next slide. Wonderful, thank you. So we were delighted to announce this year that we'd entered into a new partnership with Oxford Analytica. This collaboration has actually allowed us to create a very unique resource for academia as we move into a new decade with new challenges. Expert Briefings is a resource that's designed for universities, and it's delivered through the new Emerald Insight platform. It offers universities the same daily information that leaders are already using to make real-world decisions. Government and corporations around the world navigate changes in economic environments using analysis from Oxford Analytica. So what are Expert Briefings? Expert Briefings actually offer unbiased analysis on political and social and economic events. It's delivered in the form of daily briefs that provide instant coverage of global events. They also explore the implications and impact of emerging trends and developments. The content itself is informed by analysis from over 1,500 contributors, and every briefing is objectively reviewed by an Oxford Analytica experts. They're trusted to be informed, accurate, and rigorous. And that's why they're widely used by world leaders working in government, industry, to establish risk and inform strategy. In addition to the daily briefs, there's also an archive of over 20,000 expert briefings. So why did we think it was important to bring this content to academia? Expert Briefings are a source of trustworthy analysis that can help universities achieve research impact goals. It allows your researchers to identify the most urgent problems of today, and it encourages research that can be directly applied in the real world. The data is collated from multiple verified sources, so there's no need to actually trawl news sites that might have political or regional bias. Moving on to the benefits for students. This is real-time content that students can actually relate to, and this ensures that they're informed on how global and local events are actually shaping their future. They can help you to engage and inspire students with timely insights into topical events that are unfolding around them. Both you and your students can rely on this trusted, evidence-based source, and it can help students be prepared for the real world. It offers the thought leaders and influencers of tomorrow an historic frame of reference for the key decisions that they make by exploring the context of past decisions that have impacted on political, social, and economic events. The very concise and structured nature of the briefing allows students to quickly identify the information they need to support or counter their argument. So looking out to the benefits to faculty, we're in a current climate of very rapid change, and teaching on the core theories can remain relevant by applying analysis of recent events. You can tailor course content to the current student population using both global and local examples. And the Oxford Analytica experts have already done the work of distilling the data from multiple sources, and they can identify what's important and understand the broader significance. So daily briefings provide a single source of current content that can be easily used as a pre-read for seminar discussions, for debates, or it can form the basis of lectures. So Expert Briefings itself covers a huge number of topics, and this is just merely a snapshot of some of the very recent coverage of Expert Briefings. As you can see from topics such as COVID-19 and cybersecurity, the content's very relevant to what's happening in the world right now. So although it's published daily, it is unbiased analysis and interpretation of events as they happen. Internet searches can provide real-time updates on these types of topics. The quality of the results can vary, and you can't always trust them. And also, unlike a newspaper, this is analysis by regional experts, rather than just a simple report of events as they happen. So key issues are analysed by the Oxford Analytica community of local experts who provide analysis of the implications and predictions that capture the reality of events. This is just a sample of some of the recently published analysis on events that are happening in your part of the world. Oxford Analytica have a very carefully structured process to identify the topic and use their unparalleled global expert network to write the briefing. Once the briefs are submitted, they're reviewed, edited, and published. This editorial process produces 3 main content types. This is an example of one of the executive summaries. And one of the unique features of this resource is that very detailed analysis is condensed down into formats that can be read very quickly and easily. This eliminates many hours of time needed to research, as the content can be completely trusted. As you can see from this example, it's very quick and easy to read. And the language itself is clear, and the condensed format actually provides insight into topics for students at every level. And this includes non-native English language speakers. The expert briefings also have a longer form. It's created to ensure that information can be consumed easily in a structure that includes an assessment of the significance, analysis, and a conclusion. So basically, what happened, why it matters, and what's likely to happen next. And the third form that I'd like to show you is the graphic analysis. And that's another valuable feature of this resource. There's a huge amount of information on social distancing in this slide, but it's presented in a format that's very engaging and very easy to understand. And then additional information and sources are provided. So to actually dive more deeply into the type of content that you receive in expert briefings, I'm now delighted to hand over to Laura James from Oxford Analytica, who will take us through some very recent analysis.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Michelle, can you hear me as sample?
I can. I can hear you.
That's encouraging. Thank you. Well, as I say, it's wonderful to be here with you, and also at such an important time. I've been asked to speak very briefly about the COVID-19 crisis in the Arab world, which is, of course, a massive topic, but I think we can explore a little bit about how we're approaching it at Oxford Analytica, perhaps take a deep dive into some specific issues, and then look at the future scenarios and where we think things are actually going. And then I suspect that the most interesting content will be if you prepare your questions and have them ready to ask through the remainder of the webinar, and we can get some real debate going on even now on the kind of issues that we're all looking at. I say it's an important time because I think that as in 2011, or indeed as in 1967, Arab countries, among many others, may now be facing a paradigm shift. We're looking at the combined economic, social and political impact, not only of COVID-19, but also of national and international policy responses. These affect dynamics including the oil price, aid and remittance flows, demographic structures, government legitimacy and personal freedoms. As a former lecturer in Middle East politics, I am very aware of the challenge that such paradigm shifts present for the academic. We are, if you like, asked to provide a sweeping historical and theoretical perspective, while also staying up to date and incorporating new developments as things change day by day. I have a very vivid memory of struggling to teach a class about government and succession in Saudi Arabia on the very morning that King Abdullah's death was announced. I and everybody else working on the region will have many similar examples. Our briefings are designed then to help you sort through the massive data to identify what is actually important, to demonstrate its broader significance, and to do this in real time. My job now, as Senior Middle East Editor at Oxford Analytica, is to identify and highlight which small shifts out of the rush of news from multiple sources could actually herald fundamental change, and then to draw on the right experts to explain as clearly as possible what happened, why it matters, and, as Michelle said, what is likely to happen next. Although, as we've said, the language is designed to be simple and accessible to all audiences, at the same time, we push our experts who are protected by anonymity to be bold and specific when they unpack the implications of what's happening. So subject specialists have often told us that they find information in our briefings that they have been able to access nowhere else. It's central to our remit to be as unbiased and objective as possible, which is obviously the key starting point for academic analysis. But we also do aim to be policy relevant. I know from my own career as a consultant that many in academia are also called upon to help devise policy responses. This brings us to the example. I think one Middle East policy issue out of very many that we might look at in the context of COVID-19 is the set of challenges around information and information technology. This is at a time when people, especially in the Gulf, are more likely to be relying solely on their computers for work, to engage, and to understand new developments. There are two major trends of concern. One is the rise of disinformation or fake news and the policy responses to this. New media can hasten the spread of rumours. Within the region, we've seen many examples, and in fact, they're rising even today. Travellers from Iran and Iraq were told that camel urine could be bought as a virus cure. An old picture of a Ramadan banquet in Egypt sparked outrage when everybody was under lockdown. Q8 saw the promotion of fake COVID test kits. The UAE had a vlogger publicising a false claim about fines for using cloth masks. And there are very many more examples, which we have in fact covered in some of our analysis, as you can see on the screen in front of you. There has also been a wave of crackdowns on this kind of fake news with harsh penalties and fines. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has threatened 5-year prison terms. This potentially intersects with wider concerns about civil liberties in the COVID-19 era. This is a time, of course, when security forces are already taking on a greater role policing movement, when contact tracing apps are making it easier to keep track of populations, when online activity is, of course, much more open to monitoring than in-person interaction, And then there are migrant workers who are often subject to very specific constraints, and we've seen pictures from Lebanon, among other places. There is a risk then that control efforts could be counterproductive and further boost disinformation. If governments begin to be perceived as authoritarian or arbitrary, people may be less inclined to trust official information and give more credit to conspiracy theories. In some cases, of course, they are quite right to do so. It seems clear that in Yemen and Syria, almost non-existent testing and competitive cover-ups by warring authorities are helping the virus to spread unmonitored. Even so, as the virus returns in some cases for second and third waves, these trends could undermine public willingness to accept public health measures. On the second topic, disinformation can also be associated with scamming and phishing activity, which has seen a 3,000% global increase since February worldwide. Contact tracing apps, as well as wider remote working, can also increase cybersecurity risks. The main threats emerging worldwide are data stealing, that's personal data, proprietary business data, and also government information, as well as ransomware attacks. Now, from a technical perspective, these threats are in many ways easier to address than fake news because tech companies can identify them much more simply and deal with them. But at the same time, if we look across the region, we can see that countries have widely varying technical and legal capacity on cybersecurity issues. So if we look at the Cybersecurity Index from the International Telecoms Body, we see that in 2018, which is the last year available, Saudi Arabia, Oman and Qatar were in the global top 20. Egypt and the UAE were following up in the top 40. Although I have to say that these two countries performed pretty well in terms of up-to-date legislation on cyber issues, and the UAE has likely moved up further since the study. Kuwait and Bahrain are further down in the 60s, and it's very much worth noting that Lebanon is right in the high-risk zone, along with, more predictably, Yemen, Syria and Iraq. So in this context, as countries are addressing new challenges and looking at long-term changes in the way they use information, the internet and cyber, the IT sector is going to become a focus of intensified regional competition and also of intensified inequality. The theme of inequality leads us on quite neatly to the broader questions that I promised to at least bring up of future scenarios for COVID-19 and exit strategies. We'll start with OA's basic approach from the worldwide perspective. Ultimately, COVID-19 is going to be around until there is a vaccine. A vaccine isn't inevitable, and even when the vaccine comes, or if it comes, it will not necessarily be fully and long-term effective. There's certainly little chance of a significant rollout over the coming year to any or all of the countries that we're concerned about. Despite the good news that we've had in the last couple of days over the Oxford vaccine, there's still a long way to go. Meanwhile, we're already seeing the easing of lockdown followed by rising cases. So I think it's becoming increasingly clear that there will be second and third waves, although governments and scientists will get better at managing them with greater precision and less collateral damage. Socially, COVID-19 can exacerbate existing fault lines within societies if it falls more heavily on some communities than others due to differing access to healthcare and medical resources, for instance, away from major cities. And I think this is something that we have to look at very carefully in the context of the Gulf and of Arab countries more generally, about how urban-rural divides, citizen-migrant worker divides, various other, for example, ethnic and also religious divisions could play into COVID-19 differences as this situation draws on and draws out. And this is, of course, an issue that we are covering in our briefings. Starting then with this health outlook, we need to look very carefully at the economic implications internationally as well as for the region. At Oxford Analytica, we are very sceptical of the notion of a V-shaped recovery. Economic models tend to autocorrect for the huge contraction we'll see in 2020 by forecasting a big gain in 2021 to drive economies back to the long-term growth rate as quickly as possible. This is the theory. It seems very unlikely to work in practice. We're looking at a longer term recovery because of the ongoing dynamics in all sorts of sectors. And I think particularly in the tourism and retail sectors, both of which are important to various Arab countries to different degrees and in different ways, we could see a long-term hit to consumer confidence. It's also possible that COVID-19 has sounded the bell on peak oil. This is something we're tracking very closely indeed. Certainly, as we've looked at a prospect of a slow economic recovery globally, then oil demand is also going to recover relatively slowly. But there are questions about how people are going to respond on climate issues, particularly in developed economies. Early public opinion polling showed that climate was slipping down the list of priorities. But there are also important political forces that want to shape the crisis recovery packages that are now being designed in order to promote an energy transition. And this is really an issue to watch, particularly for oil producers in the Arab world. It also comes in the context of rising protectionism and economic nationalism. For example, of course, the US-China spat. Saudi Arabia, as chair of the G20, has really struggled to push the group to coordinate a response to the COVID-19 crisis. And there's a very clear contrast with how the G20 managed the situation in 2008. What we're actually seeing is a much bigger blame game over COVID-19, including in international institutions. And the upshot seems likely to be a much more polarized and politicized international financial system. This feeds into concerns over supply chains. Many governments are already taking a hard look at where they source essential goods from, but particularly, of course, medicine and medical equipment. And a reshoring of production for these commodities seems inevitable. But I think it could extend more broadly as people look at how they can securely get the goods they need in an uncertain world. The result is going to be, I suspect, to boost regional trade and intra-country trade at the expense of global trade. And this, again, is a very specific problem for the Middle East, where regional trade is particularly poorly developed. For instance, Gulf states' heavy dependence on global imported food supplies raises potential food security concerns, to which we are already seeing national level responses. Countries will step up efforts to agree bilateral arrangements with key suppliers. They're also likely to seek investment partnerships established by their various sovereign wealth funds. So it's not that this isn't an issue that can be managed, but the methods by which countries are going to manage it will be interesting and I think important to track in academia and more broadly. The sovereign wealth funds, which are going to have to play a role in establishing food security going forward, are also facing new and different pressures. Governments worldwide have seen a massive increase in debt, and they must at some point pay for the huge stimulus programs they've launched. As a result, global debt markets are changing very fast. We're saying there's not going to be a major growth rebound. We're looking at a possible extension of global recession with higher taxes and austerity, perhaps combined with inflation. There are, however, important differences in MENA countries' capacity to take on more debt. And this is also particularly true for Gulf oil producers, surprisingly. Real GDP is certainly going to contract sharply this year. Fiscal deficits and public debt are going to rise, but we have some countries such as Oman and Bahrain that are already in a very exposed medium-term position. They're going to struggle to access international debt markets on favourable terms, and they may have to seek help from neighbours, which also, of course, has political and foreign policy implications within the region and beyond. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait and Qatar do have more financial reserves and better access to international bond markets. Nevertheless, they're still not going to be able to borrow as much as they need to keep normality. And we have seen the austerity measures coming in. Notably, beyond the Gulf, all of this means less aid, less remittances, and less investment flowing to other Arab countries that have historically relied on Gulf funds. And of course, this also applies to countries well beyond the Arab world. GCC governments can selectively increase sovereign wealth funds' local development focus. So I think we're going to see off-balance sheet government funding of mega projects, which sovereign funds could be involved with, the consolidation of key industries, and specific programs creating jobs for nationals. Net foreign portfolios could be slowly drawn down or used as collateral to boost these kind of projects. At the same time, governments are going to be wary of overusing their reserves. That means that austerity measures will have to continue through 2020, 2021, and that's likely to dampen growth, particularly in the private sectors in the Gulf that are very dependent on the state. We can also look at a change in the profile of investments abroad, which are likely to be more aligned with domestic economic priorities. We're looking at sectors such as finance, technology, health, construction, tourism, and entertainment. That kind of alignment can, with mixed success in the past, allow expertise and indeed investment to come back into the countries that are sending out their funds. But this again depends on quite a lot of global trends. If I may finish with a final case study, I think one key industry that we need to keep an eye on going forward is airlines. And we have some upcoming analysis on this, which I'm giving you a sneak preview. Middle East airlines are forecast to lose $4.8 billion in 2020 from the pandemic. The effect on the three main Gulf airlines, Etihad, Emirates, and Qatar, is going to be more sustained than the impact on North American and Asian carriers because of their greater dependence on international travel. Moreover, low oil prices will benefit international rivals, but threaten state support to Gulf airlines. As a result, we expect to see staff numbers shrink as carriers emphasize partnership and code sharing to reach more destinations. The role of global hub is going to become a very problematic one, while people are very reluctant to travel and looking at new means of doing conferences, just as in fact we are doing today. Samia hasn't invited me out in person to come and speak to you all, much as I would have enjoyed that experience. So given their wealth and the economic importance as continuing as international hubs, the UAE and Qatar could accelerate transformation of the airline industry, and this could happen in very interesting ways. We could see more digitalization, more personalized experience beyond merely flying. What we're not going to see is a return to normal in the Gulf airline industry. And that is again going to be an important one to track. So I feel I've given you a taster of just a few of the issues that we have been working on and that we'll be thinking about going forward. It's certainly the beginning, and there's very much more that we could discuss, and I hope that you'll stay online and be available to do so. So I'm waiting for questions to be fielded and passed on, and I hope to engage in an ongoing debate with at least some of you on these issues of importance at this time.
Thank you so much, Laura. Very interesting coverage and so many questions coming and flowing out here. Let me start with a few questions directed to Michelle first. There is a question asking about, can I cite Expert Briefing in my research? Michelle?
Absolutely. Yes, you can definitely cite Expert Briefings in your research. We're about to post some information about that on the Expert Briefings website to give the citing convention.
Excellent. Another question related to Expert Briefing teaching as well. Could it be linked to VLE and Blackboard teaching curricula? Can college instructor use the content of Expert Briefing in their courseware materials?
We've been looking into that, and we should have some more updates on that quite soon.
Okay. Another question, how can I get access to the archive of Expert Briefing?
So we have two options for Expert Briefings. We have a subscription model, and that gives you access to the daily alerts with all the content behind that, and then also access to the archive. Or there's also an archive option too available, which gives you 5 years of Expert Briefings content from 2015 to 2019.
That's really good. Further question also for Expert Briefing, does it cover all countries in the Middle East?
Oh, I might need to throw to Laura for that. I believe so, but I would be
Yes.
glad if you could
No,
take that
we
question.
certainly do. We're very focused on making sure that we have full coverage. Obviously, the frequency of coverage varies depending on the country, how important it is, and also how fast things are changing. A small country can become very prominent in our analysis when things are moving fast, and people need to be aware of that. But we do cover all Middle Eastern countries.
Brilliant. A question I don't know for whom I have to direct. What is the difference between expert briefing and daily newspapers or news agencies? Which is the more kind of reliable, trusted, and should be sourced and relied on in day-to-day academic world?
So this is more rigorous research. This is actual analysis. So the type of content you tend to get in newspapers is more reporting of issues. So this is the sort of analysis that can be used and cited in academic work. Did you want to speak further to that, Laura?
I think you've put it exactly correctly. What we try to do in the expert briefings is to sort through the variety of reports and work out what is actually reliable, what's actually true, and then to say what it means, whether it's important as well as whether it's true. So there's value added in the expert briefings that for which, the reporting and many other things are raw material, but we try to bring in experts to explain what it's all about.
Great. One more question related to expert briefing itself. In one of your slides, you shed the light on peer review kind of process, which is very academic and scholarly known practice. Would you explain a little bit about the peer review process of the expert briefings?
So expert briefings content is reviewed by Oxford Analytica, who have a network of experts, including Laura. And I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to what actually happens with the content when it's actually commissioned and then received.
Certainly. What we'll tend to do is within the firm, and we have academic panels that come in every morning for a meeting to advise us on what's important, what we should be looking at. Then we'll commission content from a specific expert who knows about that issue. Depending on how well the analyst also knows about that issue, and also how well experienced the expert is, we might get a very specific peer review of their content. Otherwise, it's my job as the analyst to go through it, to edit it, to cross-check it with all the other information that we've received over the years and day by day, and to make sure that that's entirely rigorous. When I'm happy with the content, then it will be reviewed twice more within the firm by people before we put it out for publication.
Excellent. A few more questions now, touching upon the region's developments within COVID-19 implications. A very interesting one is asking, what kind of problems do you see happening in the Arab world due to COVID-19 pandemic, and what could be the way out? Over to you, Laura, I think.
Gosh, that's a really massive question. So I think that as in the whole world, we're going to see very major problems from COVID-19. And we've certainly talked a little bit about some of the health implications and societal implications, some of the IT implications, some of the economic implications. I think that if I want to highlight the most dramatic problems we're looking at, I think that we're looking at the setbacks for countries that were already struggling. So we talked quite a bit at the end about the Gulf and how Gulf countries are facing new challenges, but in fact, Gulf countries also have capacity to overcome these challenges. If we look at Lebanon and Iraq, which were experiencing protests and major political and economic crises even before COVID-19, and then we look at the impact of the pandemic on top of that. And I'll take the example of Lebanon, where lockdowns have increased suffering and hunger among the population to a remarkable degree at a time when it's getting harder to get international aid, to get international interest. You know, we're looking at a serious possibility of meltdown in Lebanon, economic primarily, and then with political implications. And I think although COVID-19 is by no means the cause, there are huge structural factors that have provoked the current crisis in Lebanon. It came just as efforts to recover were beginning to get going, and it's cut off a lot of pathways. So although I certainly can't be comprehensive in my answer to the question, I think that's an important example of how things really are changing in important ways, and we will look back in a few decades' time and things will look different because of what's happening at the moment.
You are very right. This is very broad spectrum question. It needs, I think, a couple of webinars or a couple of days and even a conference to answer it. But it opens up the gate.
To our briefings.
Yes, it opens up the gate for further similar question, but more specified. There is a quite interesting question asking about, will COVID-19 impact the cybersecurity and IT infrastructure in the Arab world, and how do you see the Arab world is going to respond to the disinformation, cybersecurity issues, and fake news?
That's another very interesting question. So I think it is going to be a major issue for a lot of countries immediately. And what's happening at the moment is that we are seeing universally efforts to crack down on fake news. So there are new rules, there are new laws, there is new enforcement of existing laws to try and manage information flows. That doesn't seem to be working very well so far. If you're watching Arabic language Twitter feeds, and particularly WhatsApp, is very hard to track or manage. So stories are spreading very fast that are incorrect. And as I say, people are not necessarily able to verify the information that they're getting coming to their laptop and their phone because they may not be going out as much as they normally would or interacting with as many people. We've seen some civil society organizations that are trying to do something about this, but I think in the end, like the rest of the world, the Arab world is going to be looking for some technical solutions. So I think that there will be purchases of new software that is currently being developed to manage cybersecurity risks, to be able to verify content more easily, to say what news is true and what isn't. I think that there are very big risks here, though, because the risk is that governments that become too heavy-handed about cracking down on fake news and also try to control information more generally, they lose trust. So there's a risk of promoting disinformation by your heavy-handedness because people say, well, the government wouldn't tell us even if it was true. In that sense, I think that there are going to be a lot of different dynamics that play into the politics of different types of political systems in Arab countries. And again, the variety is going to be a hallmark and something to watch.
So in the Arabic context, they used to say, hold the stick from the middle. They shouldn't be very extremist when they react into the fake news or disinformation on cybersecurity issues. Another question related to the cybersecurity, it seems that today is the cybersecurity questions day. How many types of cybersecurity threats do you foresee happening in the Arab world in the next few months?
That's another very good question, and I think to give a detailed technical answer, I would have to draw on our technical cybersecurity people, because I think in the sense of types of new threats, we will see very similar trends worldwide, and there'll be people who are tracking, and we have access to people who are tracking the new kinds of viruses, IT viruses rather than coronaviruses, and the new kinds of phishing and hacking scams and developments. I think that what we will see is an economic-driven problem in the sense that people are losing their livelihoods in quite a lot of different countries in quite a lot of different ways. So we're certainly going to see probably more ransomware, which hasn't been a major phenomenon in the region so far compared with some places, but I think we could certainly see more ransomware attacks. I think that there will be more phishing, so more emails being sent to try and get people's personal details in different and cleverer ways. And I think that combined with this, there is going to be more, if you like, geopolitical cyber warfare. At the moment, we're seeing a very clear uptick, and we published a double-length brief on this just a few days ago. We're seeing a very clear uptick in Iran-Israel confrontation, which has got a very strong cyber angle. And as you know, the Gulf countries often get pulled into these cyber confrontations simply because they become targets for the same sets of Iranian hackers and the same sets of tools that we've seen. And equally, Gulf countries can and often do buy Israeli commercial software to deal with these threats. So I think that mounting geopolitical confrontation, which certainly could also bring in the United States, is going to be a concern. But one thing I'd also highlight is that the healthcare sector is increasingly a target because it's so sensitive at the moment. So both geopolitically and indeed commercially, health institutions in the Arab countries need to be particularly on their guard.
Very comprehensive answer to this question. Thank you so much. Mentioning the healthcare, there is a nice question about Egypt and the healthcare system. How will COVID-19 will impact Egyptian economy, and is raising the health budget will help the country somehow to mend its economy, and how?
Well, I think Egypt is one of the countries where we are very worried about the impact of COVID-19. Not so much the virus itself, but the impact of lockdowns on an economy that is highly informal. And it's very difficult for governments to manage and address the suffering and concerns where lockdowns are in place. And where lockdowns aren't in place, then we have a different set of dynamics and a heavier pressure on the healthcare system. I think that increasing government spending on healthcare will happen, and it will obviously contribute, but I think that the scale of the problem with Egypt's healthcare system is probably larger than the amount of available funds can address. And that's taking into account the fact that Egypt is getting access to more IMF funding and is a good target for international aid and also Gulf aid. So even taking that into account, I think that the economic problem is going to be bigger than in many other countries, and that it's going to impact healthcare in ways that can't be mitigated.
Okay, that's good to know about Egypt. And if we just covered Egypt, another question is asking about economies in the Arab world, how to survive the pandemic, COVID-19 in general.
I think there's a big difference here between oil exporters and oil importers, and between countries that have adequate reserves and countries that are actually heavily indebted. So I think that there are a lot of different policy prescriptions, if you like. And obviously our job is not to provide policy prescriptions, but we can and do say, if this is done, if this policy is taken, this is likely to be the outcome. So if I may, I'll focus initially on the Gulf countries, because you can look at those together and as a coherent whole. If people want to follow up on specific other countries and how their economies, what kind of policy options they're looking at, then maybe those could come through as extra questions. But if I look at the Gulf countries, then I think that what's going to happen is Gulf countries are going to find it's quite a good time to buy cheap international investments. That's one thing. Then there is going to be a certain amount of austerity, more in Oman and Bahrain than we're likely to see in the other four countries. But in all of the countries, there will be some austerity. I think that the key question is going to be how these countries manage the transition to more nationalisation of the workforce. So there's certainly an opportunity here, as the number of expatriate workers has been cut, to sort of get a head start on the transition that we all know is going to be necessary to nationalise the workforces further. At the same time, this is a very difficult time for the private sector. You know, with the lack of demand of retail, of tourism, including religious tourism, of course, for Saudi Arabia, entertainment, travel, all of these sectors are really suffering, and there has got to be a policy to allow the private sector to withstand austerity. And this is very hard because, in fact, the private sector in most Gulf countries is very dependent on state spending. The minute state spending contracts, we see the private sector contract. There is very little lag. It's government contracts, and of course it's government payment of salaries to employees who then spend that money in the private sector that drives the economy. And that's all ultimately from oil. So there has to be some thought about how this could be used as a means to step towards, to move forward towards an oil transition. But it's got to be done while still encouraging the private sector, and that is going to be a major policy challenge.
You have mentioned the private sector. There is a question for the private sector, SMEs and entrepreneurs in the Arab world. How governments and countries should support and stimulate the state of the entrepreneurs and SMEs to get out of this pandemic? Any good advice to be taken forward?
I think that economists across the world are struggling over this. And as I say, we're not in the business of direct policy prescriptions. What I would say, that a general rule that seems to be emerging is that there needs to be immediate support now to help people get through the current crisis, because SMEs are being hit with something they could never have imagined when they were doing their business model. So what you don't want is for people to be forced out of work, to lose their investments. This is a hit that the economies can't cope with. So I think that governments that can need to invest now in just propping up businesses until domestic demand at least can begin to recover. And then I think there's a case for a longer term and more focused look about how to support SMEs going forward. And a lot of work's being done on this, but first of all, there's a very simple problem. The immediate crisis is a cash crisis, and that is what governments need to address.
I guess someone overheard you saying a support now, but they have done that yesterday. In EU, they came into an agreement to support the EU community with 750 billion euros. That EU agreement, is it going to be a blessing agreement across North and South? Is it going to affect Arab world in a positive way? What do you think?
I think that there is generally going to be a shortage of international funding. With the exception of the IMF, we are looking at squeezed aid budgets. We're looking at new demands for aid. We're looking at less investment funding as countries bring money back. So I think that generally, and I think I should have mentioned this in the answer to the previous question as well, while the ideal is to provide more support for SMEs, the governments are facing a huge range of challenges across the Arab world in how much money they actually have available to do that, how much money they actually have to keep up their day-to-day functions. And I think that the general answer to your question is, don't rely on foreign funding. It's not going to come through in very large quantities. Governments are going to have to think very carefully about where they can find money without that reliance, because expectations are very likely to be disappointed.
Yes, a related question, but kind of teaching related. In such situation, who's going to win? Keynes and its political economy scholars, or someone else? What do you think?
That is another extremely interesting question, and I think shows how we are living in a paradigm shift. We're taking our theories and the things we teach day by day in the classroom, and we are testing them against real world experiences. So I think that some short-term Keynesianism could be very welcome. But in the long term, I think we need to look at the stagflationary risks globally and regionally. So I think that Keynes isn't going to provide all the answers going forward. And one very interesting thing to look at will be how Keynes's theories need to be adapted to the modern situation, the new perspective. And I think there's been some very interesting study of this, although I'm not at the moment primarily working as an economist. I have in the past. I think there's some very interesting studies of how Keynes's theories depend on a certain set of expectations. And when consumer and government and policymaker and banker expectations change, as they are at the moment, then you have to change the theories to keep up with them. And I hope that the people who are doing that are listening to this webinar and are going to be engaging with us on day-to-day information to update those theories.
Yes, and I think someone is asking right now, could you share later on the study you referred to about the implications or the application of Keynes theory or others into the situation? It will be offline later on. If you share it with us, we will make sure that they're going to receive it, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Yeah, another interesting one comes to the supply chain. You've mentioned the supply chain and the tension between United States and China. China is the major supply chain originator. United States also supply some other non-physical goods, so there is some sort of friction. How the Arab world should place themselves in managing properly the supply chain and how they should read the situation right now.
I think that a major focus is going to have to be regional trade. And of course, there have been various pushes at various times to try and boost regional trade. But none of them have been very successful. And I think in a world where we could see import bans or export bans rather, sorry, we could see politicization of all sorts of trade. We could see the World Trade Organization functioning much less well than it previously has because of the kind of splits that it's likely to see. In that kind of world, you need to protect your access to vital commodities. And I think regional trade is the first step. Countries that can produce food sell to countries that can't, countries that have more advanced manufacturing sectors or more advanced IT or services sectors can feed back within the region because they need to worry about the longer term, longer range supply routes and the politics around those. So I think that that's one major concern. I think that, this is a changing situation. Are we still going to live in a rules-based international system? Are international bodies that regulate trade, that regulate economic assistance, going to remain functional going forward, given divisions, but also given the attitude the United States is going to take to those bodies? And of course, we're all looking to the November presidential elections to see some of the trends that are likely to come up there. So again, this is a changing issue, but regional trade, not just for the Middle East, but generally, is going to become more important.
Presidential election in United States is very much related to the question that came in about the United States-China tension and how this is going to be impacted with the presidential election by November. What Oxford Analytica can say about that?
Well, obviously, I'm a Middle East analyst, but I think that where we are on this, and my colleague Benjamin would explain better than I the nuances, is that we think a rise in tensions is quite plausible, but not yet inevitable. So we're looking at a path to a greater breakdown in relationship between the US and China, which would have impact on economics and everything else. And we can see how that path could play out, but we haven't yet got to the point where we would say that is an inevitable path. And I think beyond that, I'd have to refer you to our briefing material because I don't want to summarize Benjamin's content in an inadequate way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for that. And I think for who asked this question, the best thing is to follow up Expert Briefing and Oxford Analytica online to see Benjamin's analysis on that. We will be happy to help you some way. A very interesting questions I like so much, actually, because it touches everything here we are doing today. It's very academic in nature, but practical in practice as well. How can I find research gap in this area of research, which is the geopolitical implications or economic implications of pandemics? This is coming from someone doing research, I guess, master or PhD. He's seeking some sort of highlights on how to do a gap analysis to places research. Any help from your side?
Well, again, not personally, but I think a port of call from our end would be my colleague Katerina, who is leading on all of our COVID-19 and pandemic analysis. And obviously she's drawing on very many people, but part of her job at the moment is to read the studies that are coming out day by day. So I think that she might have an interesting starting point on what she's not seeing, on where she's having trouble finding relevant experts. And so I'd refer to her. And perhaps as a starting point, I'd refer to the content that she curates. So you can see that we have a set of COVID-19 content. And if you look through that and worked out what isn't being covered, what questions aren't being answered, then I think that's quite a good starting point for where there just isn't the information yet.
Thanks
also,
for that.
on the
Yes, go ahead,
Expert
Michelle.
Briefings Emerald webpage, we have highlighted some of that particular content. So we could follow up with a link to a list of articles that are relevant.
So there is more expert briefing covering COVID-19 made available for free for the global audience, right?
We've got a page with all of the Emerald content that we have made for free, and there's also a great deal of Expert Briefings content there too.
Excellent. A lot of people will be interested to follow and read all of those expert briefing online. Thanks, Michelle, for that. A final question for you again, Laura. Global recession plus inflation. Could you explain a little bit on that? Because this seems a very scary scenario ahead.
Sorry, can I clarify the question about inflation rising globally?
Yes, the inflation rising globally and the global recession all together. What
Yes.
can you say about that?
Well, I think that at the moment we are speculating about possible scenarios. But I think that what we're seeing is that growth is not necessarily going to recover very quickly across a lot of countries because economic activity is simply not recovering as quickly as people would like. So if we're not going to have this kind of growth rebound, then the global recession could continue. And I think at this point, if we have a recession, if fewer goods are being produced, if we've got higher taxes and austerity coming in, then I think we're looking at a potential inflationary scenario. And I think what's worth noting is that within the region, we are looking at much more imminent inflationary scenarios because of exchange rate dynamics, because of shortages, and to some extent because of government policy, where governments are looking to print money in order to spend their way out of trouble. So I think in the region, we can look at some particular countries where that recession plus inflation risk is quite high and more worrying even than it is globally.
Thank you for that highlight. Thank you so much, Laura. We have only 2 minutes now. I would like to thank Michelle for her introduction on expert briefing and how academics could use expert briefing in their classroom, in their research with their students, and in their theses. And thank you so much for Laura, the senior analyst at Oxford Analytica, for her coverage and answering a lot of questions. I hope we have covered most of the questions. If not, just follow up with us on our emails and social media. We will make sure that you get all answers. A good news for you, if you follow us on our social media and sign up for alerts as well, you could get free access to some of the expert briefing we made available for free every week. On that slide in front of you, you could see our handles for Twitter and Facebook, and there is my email as well. If you need anything, just drop me a line and I will be more than happy to help you, assist you across all of your queries. At the end, I would like to thank you for joining us today. Thanks everyone in that webinar, in that room, and have a fantastic day and a new good life after COVID-19 eradication by vaccination or by treatment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to join you.
Thank you very much.